All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining the webinar. Today, we're going to be going over HCV utilization, planning, and policies. My name is Mike Edens with CVR. I'm very happy you all have joined, and so we'll go ahead and get started. So on today's agenda, we're going to be, the training is designed to help PHAs improve their HCV utilization through planning and updated policies in order to maximize the families that are receiving housing assistance. In this training, we'll review the HUD Two-Year Tool, as well as talk about developing leasing plans, talking about coordinating staff for operations to meet the needs of a leasing plan. Additionally, go over various policy implementations that you can review for your agency to determine various policy implementations that would benefit your program. Things like that would include payment standards, portability, project-based vouchers, waiting lists, rent reasonableness, and some other things. So today we're going to start with a quick introduction. We're going to talk about the state of Alabama's utilization. We'll go into the HUD Two-Year Tool, talk about leasing policies and leasing plans, and then do a closing section as well. We will take questions throughout, so please don't be shy. We want to make this as interactive as possible. I know in technology, the new technology that we all are dealing with due to COVID, it makes it a little bit different than we're all used to, but we could still do a good training on utilization and talk through all of that with you guys today. So let's go ahead and get started. So that's me. I'm Mike. I'm a vice president with CVR Associates. That's also me before COVID. I now have COVID grays, so I have a lot of gray hair due to COVID. I've been in housing for about 17 years. I've worked at two large PHAs, one in Akron, Ohio, one in DeKalb County, Georgia. I've got extensive knowledge as it comes to CMAP, HUD guidelines, the voucher program in general, the administration of the program. I'm also a TA provider for HUD when it comes to utilization, so I talk utilization to PHAs coast to coast. I also specialize in project-based vouchers as well as relocation and know a bit about RAD as it pertains to project-based vouchers, so if you're converting your portfolios. I consider myself to be a housing nerd, so I like to talk about this stuff. So hopefully you enjoy it. As I feel free to reach out to me at any point if you're interested in chatting up about utilization, as I really enjoy talking about it. How this training kind of came about is CVR is working on a TA project with the Alabama field office. So we're working with 28 of the housing authorities there in Alabama, as well as providing various training components. And the HUD field office thought it would be a great idea to open this up to all PHAs in Alabama. So we look forward to having you guys join this broadcast. And I will also just say, yes, I am a real person. Hi. So you know that I'm a lot grayer now than I used to be. So we'll go ahead and move on from there and start talking first about Alabama utilization. And so there's a link below this slide. It's to a dashboard. And so HUD created a dashboard that all PHAs have access to, or the public has access to, and you can see what's going on in different communities throughout the country. If you would follow that link, it would take you to the HCV Housing Choice Voucher Data Dashboard, where you can view all kinds of information about different states, different PHAs, things like that. But it gives you 14 slides to show you where HUD is as a whole in all of the voucher programs, as well as breaking it down individually by state and specific PHAs. So if you are ever interested in looking at data like I am, this would be a great place to go to pull some data. It's got 14 slides that show you all kinds of information. The first slide that you see up on your screen is the Housing Choice Voucher summary page for the state of Alabama. So this is a look at what the utilization is for the entire state. As you can see, the state has been, and this is through July of 2021, so it doesn't show the whole year. This shows you that through July, the state of Alabama has received $130 million in HAP funding, of which y'all have spent $124 million. So you have a 96 or 95, I'll round it to 96% percentage of your utilization as it relates to your budget authority. Below that, you're going to see HCV total reserve balances as of the beginning of the year. So at the beginning of 2021, coming into this year, PHAs in Alabama were holding $20 million in reserve. And so what that reserve is it's HAP funds that are unspent that you guys have access to be able to continue to house additional families. If we go, and I'm going to try and get my little spotlighter out here. So, okay, there we go. So currently, the total number of vouchers under ACC for the entire state of Alabama is 39,000 vouchers, of which, as of July, 33,000 vouchers were in use, which left roughly 5,700 vouchers unused, with a year-to-date leasing percentage of 85%, meaning you're using 85% of your vouchers that you have. So when you compare it to how much funding you have, you're spending 95% of your funds, but you're only leasing 85% of your vouchers. The average per unit cost, or PUC, is $529.98, with a leasing potential of almost 2,000 vouchers. And then here down at the bottom, it shows you a little budget and unit utilization, and it gives you a chart over the last 6 years, it looks like. And what we can see is that the amount of funding that's being spent by PHAs in Alabama since it looks like late 2020 through July of 2021 has it's taken a significant dive in terms of how much money you're spending for your programs right now as it relates to the amount of vouchers that you're using, or the amount of money that you're spending. This next slide also comes from the HCV summary that HUD provides. This is about project-based vouchers, and I bring up project-based vouchers because I like project-based vouchers. I think it's a great use of vouchers, and it's a way to put hard units on the voucher program. But what this shows is that currently in Alabama, there's 18 PHAs with project-based vouchers that are using project-based vouchers. There's 18 PHAs that have HAP contracts, as well as have residents who are leased under a HAP contract. The other thing to look at over here is that as a total, it's 10% of the total number of vouchers available in the state, which is 3.54 million. I don't know that that delineates RAD vouchers that might be in there. I'm not sure that it does, but I think it's something that's definitely worth noting because there's some opportunity to project-based vouchers there in the state if that's something that anyone that would be interested in. Additionally, at the bottom here, I've also, and I just cut and paste this from a different slide, but I just wanted to show you your special program vouchers there in the state. You've got 641 mainstream vouchers. You've got 119 FUP vouchers, 432 NED vouchers, which are near elderly disabled vouchers, almost 1,300 VASH, for a total of 2,500 special purpose vouchers. So I think that's an interesting thing that I thought would be good to kind of show what the state has going on. And so what we're here to talk about is how to maximize leasing, right? The intent of the program is to provide as much housing as possible to the residents that we serve. And so when it comes to leasing, if the PHA is not leasing 100% of your vouchers or spending all of your money, you're not utilizing all of the resources for your program. And it can result in being underutilized, which may result in different penalties under the CMAP funding, the CMAP scoring, reduced funding, or the recapture of reserves. One thing to keep in mind, and to always keep this in mind, is if you aren't, your funding is based off of how much you spend. So if you're not spending as much as you have, your funding in future years is not going to be what it was in previous years. Your funding is based off of what you spend. And so it's always important, even if you don't have even if you don't have available vouchers, but it's always important to maximize the amount of funds that you're spending. Failure to maximize the utilization of your program could result in families in need of assistance not being assisted, as well as lost administrative revenues. So for every voucher that you have that goes unutilized, you are losing out on admin fee. Additionally, as it relates to the CMAP program and CMAP scoring, HUD expects high performers to maintain an average utilization rate of 98% or better. And that 98% is either of your ACC units, so your total number of vouchers, or your obligated funding for that year. A PHA achieving a standard level of performance is expected to maintain its utilization at 95% or above, and utilization below 95 will result in a failing score on the utilization CMAP indicator, which is worth 20 points and automatically defaults you into standard, gives you a standard score. So, not only is it important to maximize your funding and the vouchers that you have for the families that you serve, but it also impacts your scoring. Again, as I mentioned on the previous slide, 98% or greater will get you the 20 points in CMAP, 95 to 97% will get you 15 points, less than 95% and you get 0 points. You cannot reach high performer status if 0 points are received in this indicator. So it's really, I look at utilization as the most important thing that you can watch on your voucher program. It allows you to determine what you need to do operationally to issue vouchers. It determines how much administrative fee you're going to receive, which allows you to budget correctly for what your staffing level should be. It allows you to maximize the number of families that you serve, which is really the ultimate intent of utilization, is to help as many families as possible. I know we're in affordable housing, right? There's always a lot of talk about there's not enough affordable housing and things like that. But when it comes to leaving money on the table or vouchers on the table, it does beg the question of, can we help more families than we actually do? And the answer to that is usually yes. And so always be mindful of what the utilization of your program looks like, because it's really, in my opinion, the most important indicator for how we can serve families best. All right, I will get off my soapbox and kind of dive into it. We're going to start talking about the HUD Two-Year Tool, because that's really one of the most important things that you can utilize effectively to maintain and manage your program. So when it comes to the Two-Year Tool, you can't use the Two-Year Tool without knowing how VMS works, right? Because the Two-Year Tool is fueled by the information that is put in VMS. So the information you put in VMS is basically downloaded into your tool, and you can utilize that information and the data that's put into your VMS system to manage your tool. So it's of the utmost importance that PHAs are analyzing the data you put into VMS and making sure that it's accurate, because inaccurate VMS information is going to really potentially mess up the utilization of your program, because you don't know how many vouchers you have, or you don't know how much money you're spending. So it's very important to understand how VMS works and to make sure that you're accurately inputting information into VMS so that your two-year tool is accurate. Why does it exist? Well, the VMS system, which is the voucher management system, was mandated by Congress. It creates a reliable source of information regarding voucher leasing and related costs. It's informative. VMS is a key source of information for determining funding levels, as well as it keeps you connected with the data that is periodically reconciled in PIC and the FDS information, so that PHAs may have to explain the differences if there's information that is different in PIC than it is in VMS. So it's very important to make sure that your data is accurate and matching with the 5058 submissions that you're making into PIC. When it comes to VMS, you need to make sure you're aware of the source of the data. So your VMS is basically the information that you're reporting out of your system of record for any of your active 50058s. Things that you're going to monitor in there include units month leased, housing assistance payments, whether it's the first of the month or the middle of the month, as well as months of which payments are attributed to. So, for example, if you did an interim effective, July 1st that you guys forgot to do, or someone on your team forgot to do, you would need to go back and make any retroactive payments that you made and update that data in VMS. You can't just take what you paid in one period and crunch it all into the month of October. You would need to attribute those HAP dollars to the correct months that they are attributable to. So, if your interim from July resulted in a $200 HAP payment in July, August, and September, you need to increase the amount that you paid out in HAP in your VMS system in July, August, and September. Additionally, sources of data that are not included in your system of record would include things like project-based vouchers that are under an AHAP. And an AHAP is an agreement to enter into a HAP contract. So that would be, generally it's for new construction or sometimes rehab properties that you have agreed to go into a HAP contract for, that you will in the future, but you're not actively paying for those units because it's being developed. Additionally, PBV units that are under a HAP contract but not currently leased would be something you wouldn't necessarily be pulling out of your system of record, but that's something you're going to need to make sure you put in VMS so that it's showing how many outstanding PBV units you have out there, as well as PBV units that are leased plus not leased should equal the total number of PBV units that you have under a HAP contract. So if you've got 100 PBV unit property and you have 90 that are leased, there you should be reflecting 10 unleased in your VMS system. Additionally, new vouchers issued, you'll need to make sure you're putting an accurate number in there for your VMS. And I'll say this, is sometimes, this is a tricky one, right? New vouchers issued doesn't always reflect correctly in the 2-year tool when it gets pulled from VMS. A lot of times what I see when I pull tools down from the HUD website, which you can do, you can pull anybody's 2-year tool down if you're interested in knowing what your neighbor's got going on, but you can pull any PHA's tool down, and it never really has the new vouchers issued in there correctly. Generally, what I see in there is kind of the sum of all of the vouchers that are on issue, and so if you are pulling your tool down from the HUD website, you want to make sure that you go into your tool and put in the correct number of vouchers that were issued from your waiting list on each given month. 2 more slides, I think only 2 more slides about VMS, and then we'll keep going. I just wanted to show you something real quick that I do when I review VMS. So when you're pulling down a VMS, you get this giant spreadsheet, right? And there's so many blank spaces that it's hard to really analyze. And so what I would encourage you to do is when you do pull down your VMS and you want to review kind of month to month how things went, what I like to do is delete out the lines, and so I can kind of see it more clearly. Another way you could do this as well is to add a line in between each section and determine what your per unit cost for each different program is, because it can give you a sense of possibly finding a discrepancy in the data that you have in your system. And so just kind of looking through this, you're seeing, a whole lot of vouchers being issued here in, let me pull out my spotlight. All of your other vouchers kind of just, I'm just looking through this line, right? So if you're looking through your VMS, you're seeing that you lost 13 vouchers from April to May. And then you're going back up after that. but that's a significant decrease in comparison to some of the previous months where you were at 9 and 8. And if you're losing 13 here, that might make me question what happened that month. So it's good to review your VMS data to see if there's anything that looks off to you, so that you can catch it and correct the data so that you're reflecting it appropriately in the two-year tool. A lot of times there's issues with some of the data entry that happens in VMS because it's a manual entry. And so it's always good to take a second look at what you actually submitted and make sure that there wasn't a typo or something that isn't giving you enough, in this case, isn't accounting for all of the vouchers that you have on your program. So the importance of the two-year tool for leasing projections, right? Leasing projections ensure that your program maximizes the utilization of your available funding. It allows you to determine how to serve the most possible households that you can. It allows you to minimize the risk of shortfall if that would be something that you would be subject to, something you need to monitor to make sure that you don't fall into. It helps you to accurately budget for your administrative fee revenue and appropriately allocates your work resources based off of your anticipated workloads. And we'll kind of go into that in a little bit. Kind of a recommendation I have in terms of reviewing your two-year tool is at least monthly, your voucher department should prepare leasing projections using the tool. And you'll see TYT in here. I use that acronym for two-year tool. So if you've never seen that acronym, or if you're like, what's TYT? That's what it is. But anyway, on a monthly basis, update your tool for the most current actual leasing and HAP expense data. Enter any vouchers that were issued or are projected to be issued for the current and upcoming calendar year. So you don't want to just, plan out 3 months in advance. You want to plan out for like the rest of the year so that you can see what you need to do to determine how many vouchers you need to issue and how much money you have. You need to review your lease-up rates and ensure that you do not exceed the authorized number of vouchers that you have. Review your projected HAP expenditures to make sure they don't exceed the amount that's authorized for funding and available reserves. You need to reduce planned leasing activity and or explore cost-cutting measures if your projected expenditures result in shortfall. As well as if projected expenditures don't achieve 98% of funding or voucher, you need to go ahead and see how you can increase the planned number of vouchers that you issue. And your goal for doing that is to develop a leasing plan that maximizes the number of families that you can serve. The role of HCV, as you all I'm sure know, is to make sure that you are, or to handle the waiting list as well as eligibility. Prepare briefings, inspections, rent reasonableness and lease up, as well as long-term changes to the caseloads. Now, the role of the finance department. So a lot of times, and what I've seen and what I've also experienced having worked at housing authorities, is the finance department and the HCV department are not always connected. I know, especially in larger PHAs, and I've been a part of this, to where you get siloed, right? HCV does this and finance does that. And if you guys don't talk, if the HCV and finance teams don't talk, you can't be on the same page with what's going on with your program as it relates to the number of vouchers that you can issue and the amount of cash that you have to issue vouchers. And so the role of the finance department should be to use the leasing projections that are done in the two-year tool so that you can plan for HAP expenditures as it relates to cash flow. So if you do a whole bunch of additional leasing, the amount of funding that you have in your finances bank account might not be enough to cover all of your additional leasing. And so you need to talk together to make sure that you have enough cash. And when you don't, you need to make sure you tap into your HUD held reserves by reaching out to your FMC, your financial management center, and requesting additional HAP funding from your reserve. Additionally, compare your projected expenditures in coming months and distribution schedules. So in using the tool, the finance team generally gets the disbursement schedule, so you know how much HAP funding is coming in. But when you look at the tool, you might, if you've done a bunch of additional or new leasing, you might see that your expenses are going to exceed your disbursements. And so you need to be in lockstep together with that as to how you can access your reserves, as well as not to make your finance department panic, which can sometimes happen. Additionally, if scheduled disbursements aren't sufficient, I mentioned this earlier, contact your FMC to request additional funds from the HUD held reserve. Also, verify that the leasing plan, working with your finance department, does not create a shortfall situation or underutilization of your funding. So a lot of times it's good to get the number crunchers in the room, and a lot of times that comes from finance departments to make sure that the numbers look good and they look legit, and that you can work together to identify any errors there might be, as well as make sure that you can maximize your program. So long story short, right? Too long, didn't read, TRDL. Talk to your finance department. You guys are a team. You need to make sure you're both on the same page with what you're doing. It's extremely important and often overlooked. Additionally, through this process, you can identify any budgetary shortfalls as it relates to your admin fees. So knowing what your leasing is going to be, you can project that you're going to be receiving additional admin fee funding, which you can talk to your finance folks about and be like, hey, I can now hire another person to handle all of this extra work. It's good to have those conversations with the finance team so that you're all in lockstep and on the same page with how this actually goes. So when it comes to the two-year tool, special purpose vouchers sometimes count and sometimes don't. What I mean by that is when you're using your two-year tool that's a component of your total voucher program, the two-year tool includes VASH, NED, and FUB. It does not include EHV, which is your emergency housing vouchers, which are the new allocation of vouchers that are out there, nor does it include mainstream. I believe there's new tabs in the two-year tool for mainstream. I think there's one in there I know there's one in there for VASH as well. But those aren't really included in your total voucher allocation when we're talking about the two-year tool. And so what we're talking and focusing about on today is really that, your regular vouchers, right? Which includes all of your project-based, all of your RAD, all of your VASH, NED, and FUP, as well as your regular tenant-based vouchers. We're not talking about emergency housing vouchers or mainstream vouchers. And so the key data for accurate projections as it relates to your two-year tool, and we'll get kind of deep into the two-year tool here in a minute, but you need to make sure you have accurate projections for your attrition rate, your waiting list response rate, your eligibility success rate, your voucher success rate, typical time frames for each stage of the lease-up process, anticipated per unit costs, as well as the impact that payment standards and utility allowance changes have on your program. And so as you can see here on the screen, we're going to start breaking down different components of the tool just to make sure everyone's on the same page, okay? So first up, we've got the initial BA, which is budget authority. So your initial funding, right? So in this case, I'm using an example from 2020. They have this PHA has 3,180 vouchers. Their total funding is 31 million in 2020. They have they weren't subject to offset in 2020, meaning they spent more than a certain percentage, and I'll get into that here in a little bit. They didn't apply nor receive any set-aside funding. So if everyone remembers or if you don't remember, I'll tell you, I think it comes out sometime in March every year. There's a PIC notice that comes out talking about set-aside funding, where you can apply for additional HAP funds for your program. And so if you do apply for set-aside funding, that amount would come into this section of your tool. You've got your new ACC unit funding. So if you are getting new increments of vouchers, in this case, they're getting $45,000 worth of new increment vouchers. Those could be from a new allocation of, VASH or FUP or Section 18 redevelopment type activities. And what this basically does here is it totals your budget authority plus any set-aside funding and new units to give you a total ABA funding. Your PHA income column here is any fraud recoveries. It's 50% of your fraud recoveries that you receive from any repayment agreements that residents are paying on. And then totals at the bottom to give you a total cash supported figure there. And then finally, your total funding available gives you, your total cash supported prior year reserves is the reserves that you carried over into 2020. So in this case, this PHA was carrying over 3.1 million from 2019. And so our total funding available for this specific case is 34 million, which is your total ABA plus your new units plus PHA income plus reserves, and gives you a total funding amount. One thing to look at here, and we'll go over this here in a little bit, is this offset to HAP reserve. So this is a negative number. If you don't spend your money, you can lose it. And so I think in this next slide, I talk about that. No, maybe not the next one. One of these ones coming up. In terms of program projection variables, so what these are on your two-year tool is your success rate. And what I feel is the most important thing in the tool is the success rate of your program, right? The success rate is what percentage of families that receive a voucher actually lease up, right? The tool defaults to 70%. And from the majority of the PHAs that I work with, that number is significantly lower, but not all PHAs know how to even track how successful their vouchers are. And it plays a key role in determining what your operations need to be like, what your outreach is like, and gives you a good idea of what's going on with your program based off of the success rate. If your success rate is not monitored and not tracked, your projections will be off. And so a little bit further in the presentation, we'll go through the success rate. And so I'll stop talking about it now. Time from issuance. So this is your section here. How long does it take for a voucher that is issued to lease up and actually go under contract? The annual turnover rate is up here, which is the turnover rate of your program. So that's generally pulled from PIC data that gets downloaded into the tool, and you can adjust that number if you want to, and sometimes it's important to, but that's it plays a pivotal role in a lot of things as well. In terms of your estimated attrition, and so this is an old tool. I'm not sure what the estimated inflation is supposed to be here in going into 2022, but your HAP funding will be increased based off of that inflation percentage from 2021 to 2022, and that is populated by HUD. So I don't know that that's been finalized yet, but you have an inflation percentage in there as well. In terms of success rate tracking, so like I had mentioned on the last slide, I think this is the most important, often overlooked section of the entire two-year tool. And so when you go into the tool, there's a lot of hidden tabs at the bottom. And you can right-click on any of the tabs and click on Unhide, and you'll find the success rate tracking worksheet. And what this worksheet does is it allows you to put the number of vouchers that were issued in a given month, and then the months that those vouchers leased up. right? So in this example, 25 vouchers were issued in January of 2020, 15 of them leased, and 5 in February, April, May, June, and then 10 failed, meaning 10 did not lease up. And so by tracking the success rate in this tool, it's going to provide you with information as to the actual success rate of your program. At the bottom of that tool, it will give you this success rate tracking section in a summary report, right? So in this case, the vouchers that leased up in January, February, and March led to a success rate of 63%. 27% of them leased up in the first 30, 20 and 60, 24 and 90, 12 in 90 to 120, and 16% beyond 120 days. And so when your two-year tool defaults into a success rate of 70% and defaults down here from the time of issuance to 1840, 38 and 4, what you're going to need to do is update the front summary page of your tool to accurately reflect what the success rate of your program is. So I wanted to show you this as well. I had talked earlier about attrition or your annual turnover rate. So this is from the HUD summary report for the entire state of Alabama that I was showing you at the beginning. And one of the things you can pull in this report here is the annualized attrition trend as it relates to the state of Alabama, right? And so what it shows me is that in January of 2020, the annual turnover rate was 11.62%. And as time goes by, right, as time's going by, this rate is declining from January of 2020 through, the beginning of 2021. And I saw this report, and I was like, man, I wonder how much of this was because of COVID. And now that things seem to be opening back up, eviction moratorium is lifted, things like that, the attrition rate has the potential to go back up, because from a 2-year period, you went from 11%, 11.6% to 9.6%, right? So that's a 2% decrease, which is actually fairly significant based off of the size of your program. But a 2% decrease in your attrition rate can play a big role in how many vouchers you need to issue. And so I would highly recommend, based off of this graph alone, that you monitor your annual turnover rate, because what I suspect is that this percentage is going to, over the next year, is going to go back up to kind of where it was here. And as you can see, bottoming out here at 9.15%, it's steadily gone up over the last 3 months. It dipped back down here in July, but as somebody who's run a voucher program, I would be monitoring my annual turnover rate now that things have opened back up and that residents, can be evicted for different things, because I think it's something that will start to creep back up and you want to pay attention to. All right, going back to the front page of the tool, you've got an outcomes tab. Oh, it's not a tab. On your summary sheet, you've got your outcomes, right? The 2-year tool shows your outcomes of your planned leasing activities, including your units month leased, your percentage as it relates to the percentage of vouchers that are leased, HAP expenses as a percentage of all funds, in funding utilized, HAP as a percentage of eligibility, as well as a percentage of the budget authority used. Remember, we're targeting 98%, not to exceed 100% of your vouchers, as well as your HAP reserves and excess reserves, which come from unutilized amounts at risk of recapture. And so the key end of year results here at the end of 2020, this PHA example had excess reserve of $3.3 million. their total HAP reserve as a percentage of their ABA was 16%, meaning that 3 million represented 16% of their total funding, right, in reserves. And you really, that's way too high for a large PHA. And so you can use this this leasing and spending outcomes and following your projection section to determine what you need to do on the leasing side to lessen the amount of reserves that you have. And so to that end, if you have excess reserves, you could be subject to HAP offsets. And that's dependent on your PHA size. If your PHA is less than 250 vouchers, you do not want to carry a HAP reserve balance of over 12%. Any amount over 12% could be subject to offset. For a PHA between 250 and 499 vouchers, you could be subject to a 6% offset of your HAP reserves. If you have more than 500 vouchers, if you have more than 4% of HAP reserves, you could be subject to offset. And so this is a substantial number of PHAs have significant balances that are beyond these percentages, which leads to underutilization of voucher programs and underutilization of the funding of the programs. And so the impact of an offset, right, as we were looking at our example earlier, they had an offset in 2021 of $825,000. I'm assuming a per unit cost of $700 per voucher, an admin fee of $65 per voucher leased. The offset is costing the housing authority the ability to house 98 families. Additionally, the offset is costing the housing authority the ability to earn $76,000 in admin fee, which is, you know, a person or two to help service these families. And so really the impact of underutilization of your program is you're not housing families and you're losing funding for the administrative needs of your program, as well as losing future funding of your program. So they're losing almost $1 million because they're underutilizing their program. And so it's, you know, I think HUD refers to utilization as a new acronym for you. It's called a WIG. It's a wildly important goal. And the wildly important goal for HUD is to maximize the utilization of the voucher program. So it should be a wildly important goal for all PHAs to understand that is of extreme importance. And so I'll stop beating the dead horse, but let's work on our utilization because it's really, really important. Kind of one other section here in the tool is the summary outcomes tab. Well, it's not a tab, a summary outcomes. When you have your tool open, it's in the top right-hand corner of your tool, and you can it just kind of floats up there. And as you mess with the tool by adding vouchers being issued or PBVs coming online or changing your success rate, these percentages will change. And so you can get a quick snapshot while not even having to scroll up or down when you're putting in new vouchers that you've issued and things like that to see the impact it's going to have on your HAP reserve percentages. Keeping in mind that, you know, you want to be under 12% if you are 250 or under. You want to be under 6% if you're 250 to 499, and you will be going to be under 4% when it comes to a PHA who has more than 500 vouchers. So keeping an eye on your summaries outcome is important to be able to try and achieve that need to get to that percentage, or otherwise you're going to potentially be subject to offset. So using the two-year tool for projections, the projection section of the tool is used to, it's initially, like I said, populated by VMS, so make sure your VMS is accurate. It allows for the actual leasing and HAP that's not reported yet in VMS. So if you have done your check run, you can update your tool prior to VMS being reported. That's something I would recommend you do so that you can stay ahead of it and not wait for everything to go up to VMS and then get reported back down. Keep an eye on your tool prior to it even being submitted to VMS. It allows you to facilitate an analysis of the impact of different voucher issuance scenarios. And so different voucher issuance scenarios could be if your success rate went up, or if your success rate went down, or if your attrition spiked, or if your attrition went down, or what happens if your payment standard goes up. Things like that. It allows you to run different scenarios in terms of those key indicators, as well as for your voucher issuance. So what happens if you issue 200 vouchers at the beginning of January as opposed to 100? What's the long-term impact that that has on your program? The two-year tool allows you to run that analysis. It also projects your leasing rates and related expenses resulting from voucher issuance. So you need to know what that is to make sure that you have sufficient funding to cover future anticipated expenses, as well as allows you to update projected funding reserves and utilization rates. And so here's an example of a two-year tool. And I'll just run through this quickly because I know that the field office has a great two-year tool specialist who's worked with a lot of the PHAs, but your UMAs is your unit months attributed. So in this case, the Housing Authority had 1,080 vouchers in January, and then they got a new allocation of vouchers starting in February of 2020. Your actual UMLs is your unit month leased. So these are the number of units that were leased in those given months. Your actual HAP, so this is what your HAP expenses actually were. Vouchers to be issued or projected to be issued. So this is where you would put any vouchers that you expect to issue at any point. And to my point earlier is don't just put what you're going to issue in September or October. Drag it out through the entire year so that you can truly project what you need to do, because this will give you an idea of what your utilization of your program is going to be like if you do issue 50 vouchers every month or whatever the case might be. Other planned additions or reductions. So what this section is for is it's generally for one of two things. It's for your ports that you are absorbing, or it's for your project-based vouchers. Because you're not issuing a voucher to a port and counting that as one of your vouchers until you actually absorb it, you're not going to put it here in your vouchers issued or projected to be issued. It's going to go under your other planned additions or reductions, right? So if you have, an annual or a monthly turnover of PBV units of 1, you anticipate that you're going to lease up 1 PBV unit every month. Or if you look at your historical data and you issue or you absorb 12 vouchers every year, you could put a 1 here so that you're anticipating immediate planned additions or reductions in this column. Additionally, if you are a PHA that has a lot of your vouchers absorbed, you need to be aware of how many of those vouchers are being absorbed on a monthly basis. And these numbers here, instead of a positive, might be a negative too. Because I'll tell you this, when it comes to port outs that are absorbed, or port outs in general, are entered into 5/8 as a type 5. They're not type 6s. And therefore, it doesn't always get counted in your annual turnover rate that I showed you at the beginning or a couple of slides ago, where it's at the top right next to your success rate. Because it's a type 5 and not a type 6, it's not always accounted for in your turnover rate. And so to combat that, you can either put increase your turnover rate to a higher percentage. So if it was 5%, you could put 5 point, whatever that might look like. Or you could put a negative number in these months if you know that you're losing vouchers to ports that are being absorbed by other PHAs on a monthly basis. So it's important to know your data when you're entering this information in here to this section. New leasing from issued vouchers. So basically what this section is this this is how the projection works, right? If you're projecting to issue 75 vouchers, it takes 75 and multiplies it by your success rate, and that percentage is then multiplied by your 30, 60, 90, 120, 150 to project how quickly those vouchers will lease up. So in this case, you issued 125 vouchers, and you only had 17 plus 71, you had 88 that leased up. The section next to that is your estimated attrition. So this takes the number of vouchers that you have under lease, your unit month lease, multiplies it by your annual turnover rate. So in this case, you need to be aware that you are losing 7 vouchers a month on average based off of your turnover rate. And so looking at it like that, if you're not issuing vouchers every month to cover the units that or the vouchers that you're losing, your program size is going to continuously shrink, which is in our next section. So it's showing your units month leased projected. This is taking the number of units that you have, or the number of vouchers that you have, and adding any planned additions, taking out any attrition, and calculating what that amount would be. So in the previous month, you were at 2,834. In August, you're projected to be down to 2,828. So going down through the rest of the year, you're looking at ending 2021 at 2,813 vouchers, because you're not issuing a bunch of vouchers along the way. You're issuing large chunks of vouchers here, but by not issuing them throughout the year to cover your estimated attrition, you're just continuously losing vouchers. In terms of your HAP projected, this takes the number of vouchers that you have for your units month leased that's projected and multiplies it by your PUC, your per unit cost. And this is an extremely important column to pay attention to. The column next to it is yellow. And anytime you see a yellow in the two-year tool, it allows you to input data. And so when it comes to a PUC, you can override the amount, or the amount that you have projected to be expensed on a per voucher basis. So if you are increasing your payment standards, your PUC is likely to change. And so you need to analyze your program to determine what an increased payment standard will do to your PUC. Because if you don't, and your per unit cost goes up significantly because of that payment standard change, you could find yourself in a bad spot. So you need to pay attention to your PUC, and you need to know what your PUC could potentially be going up to. What you don't want to see in your per unit cost is a bunch of yo-yo, right? So it went from 871 in January to 834. To me, that's a significant decline in your per unit cost. That's over $30 per voucher. And I would question that number just because of the significant decrease from one month over the next. And then it obviously shoots back up here. So that's something you definitely want to keep an eye on when you see a PUC take a steep dive from one month over the next. The other thing to be aware of is whatever your most current month is, generally it's going to carry that PUC through the end of the following year. And so that's not necessarily true. So you need to pay attention to your PUC because it's something that can significantly impact things. Your cumulative amounts here, so this is your cumulative annual lease, right? So you're utilizing 89% of your vouchers. You're anticipated to, by the end of the year, utilize 89% of your vouchers, which is a 0 on CMAP. Same here with your cumulative eligibility expended. So you're spending 93% of your vouchers. That's a 0 on your CMAP as well. So that's what those sections are. This is your unit month leased percentage and your unit month expended percentage. I'm much more concerned about my annuals than I am on my monthlies. All right, on this next projection, what I'm trying to show you is how you should look at your voucher program and determine how many vouchers you need to issue on a monthly basis and project it throughout the current year as well as the following year, so that you can see the impact it's going to have. obviously these numbers aren't going to change much as it relates to our cumulative percentages. But as it relates to our cumulative percentages down here, going into the end of 2021, we would have been at 108% of our cumulative eligibility expenditures, which means that we would have tapped into our HUD health reserves to pay or to tap into that to pay down some of our reserves. Or not, pay down is the wrong word. I think you know what I mean. You're trying to expend those additional reserves that you have. Another way to look at your projections, right, is to determine how many vouchers that you can actually lease. So this is a different PHA. They've got 4,950 vouchers. They're using 4,539 vouchers. They haven't projected their vouchers to be issued. They haven't projected any planned additions or reductions. They have 17% HUD held reserves as of projected to be at the end of 2021 and 28% going at the end of 2022. And so a trick I like to do is when you are going through the process and you're not sure how many vouchers you can actually issue, one good way to figure it out as to how many vouchers you can issue is to find the difference, right? To find the difference between your unit month lease and your actual unit month lease, and put your total over here into your other planned additions and reductions section. And then in this case, the PHA had an annual turnover of 26 vouchers a month. And so I'm just to see where this PHA would stand, I put in 26 vouchers a month every month to maximize the vouchers within their program. And so basically what I did is I fully utilized this PHA's program. And what it came out to show me is that even by fully maximizing this program, the PHA still had 16% in reserves, which leads me to other questions that we would ask later. But in this example, by putting information to fully maximize your program through the end of the following year, you want to see what the impact that has on your HAP reserve. And I'm going to show you another example in this next slide. So this is another PHA, right? This is another PHA where I maximized the number of vouchers that they had, right? So they had 1,900 vouchers. They're using 1,600. I'm maximizing the program. Their attrition was putting them at 14 a month. So I leased up everything. Let's just say magically everybody leased up, even though I hadn't issued any vouchers. And what we see is that even by fully maximizing the program in 2021, we wouldn't get under our 4%. But if we continued leasing 14 a month, we would go into the negative on our HAP reserve, meaning we'd be in shortfall. So with this PHA, you can do this quick little study or scenario to determine, can you fully utilize your voucher program or not? And so I would recommend everyone give this a go to see if you have the ability to fully maximize your program or not. Because if you can do, X number of things. If you can't, you can do a different set of things. But it's a good way to see how much cash you got and how many families you can actually help. Here's one last scenario for this PHA. So this is a small PHA. They've got 69 vouchers, 63 were leased up in June. So I fully utilized their program here in 2020, and then going through, or in 2021, and then going through in 2022. Their HAP reserve would be at 9%. So because it's a small PHA under 250 vouchers, being below 12% would mean you would not be subject to offset. So that would be in a good spot. That would be a good spot to be in for that PHA. But it also means that they can certainly do some significant leasing based off of the size of the program to get folks housed. All right. So that's some two-year tool talk. Before I continue, I want to kind of open it up to see if we've got any questions so far. I've been talking for an hour. Someone please ask me some questions. So I'll ask you guys a question. Do you use the two-year tool? The first question, so the offset of HAP reserves is a reduction of the HUD reserves. So I'm not totally sure that it's a reduction of the HUD reserves. It certainly could be. Let's go back to our slide that kind of shows us that. So how it shows up in the tool. So I think it's kind of semantics, to be honest, Paul. The way I'm looking at it, if it's an offset here, right? So your budget authority is your total amount of funding minus any HUD or any offset, and then it's still totaling your total funding here. I don't know that it's a swipe out of the HUD reserves or a reduction in the amount of monthly funding that you would receive. At the end of the day, it's coming from basically the same pot. All right, we've got a question here from Lori. What do we do when there is a housing shortage that's causing our percentages to be low? So in the next section, talking about leasing policies, I'm going to give you some ideas on how you can, what you can do about that. That's a situation that I think all PHAs are dealing with. And it could be coming from, you know, a variety of different reasons. And in the next section, we'll kind of, we'll go over what to do about housing shortages and how to combat that. Because you might not be able to, but there could be other ways to get new landlords involved in the program and things like that. And so in the next section, I'll talk more about that. But that's an excellent question that I look forward to answering. All right, Paul. So does the cumulative eligibility expended column include reserves? Let's go back to that column. So cumulative eligibility expended, yes, it includes reserves. So in our example here, we went over 100%, meaning we're tapping into our reserves to pay for a percentage of the HAP funding that is being paid out in excess of what our normal annual funding would have been. So to answer your question, yes, the cumulative eligibility expended percentage column does include what you have access to in your HUD held reserve. So when it comes to leasing policies, the most important thing when it comes to your leasing policies is your payment standard. And your payment standards, as you all know, should be between 90 and 100%, 110% of the FMRs. HUD did post the FMRs. They post them each year, but the FMRs for 2022 are now currently posted. I think they were updated sometime in late August or mid-September. So the 2022 FMRs are currently active. This is actually a hyperlink that you can go to and look at the FMRs for 2022 if you'd like to. But why payment standards matter is because payment standards can change your PUC, your per unit cost. So it's important to analyze what payment standards, how payment standards affect your per unit cost. So when you're looking at your tool, right, you've got, in our case here, we've got, you know, a per unit cost of $459, you know, between $470 and $450, $460, and we've got these HAP reserves sitting out here in regards to, you know, 15.7% and 23.7%. And so one thing you can do to respond to one of the questions earlier, what to do when there's a housing shortage, how can you update your percentages? One thing you can do is to adjust your payment standards accordingly. If your payment standards are already at 110%, there is another step you can take, but I think I'll get to that on a future slide. But your payment standards would could potentially increase your per unit cost and therefore drive down your reserve. In this case, what I did is I made an example of we increased our payment standard for this PHA, and I didn't show the whole thing, but this is for November, right? We increased our payment standard, and it increased our per unit cost to $500 a month. What it does to our HAP reserves in 2022 is it drops it to 15%, as opposed to where it was in the previous section, of 23%, right? And so by adjusting our payment standard and increasing our per unit cost, it obviously would drive down our reserve. Now, there's some analysis that needs to be done to determine the impact of your per unit cost from increasing the payment standards, but you can adjust, you can affect your reserves by paying more on your payment standards than you currently are, if that's possible. Now, your next question could be, Mike, well, how can I raise all of my payment standards in November when I have to do it at every annual? So one thing to keep in mind is payment standards, you can change the way you deal with your payment standards due to the COVID waivers that came out in PIC Notice 2021-14. And there's a link to it here, and I put a clip it up on the screen. So one of the COVID waivers allows you to increase your payment standards during the HAP term of the contract, meaning you don't need to wait until the next annual re-exam to increase your residence payment standards. And so what you could do, instead of waiting to the next annual, if you increase your payment standards, is you could increase all of your payment standards to the 2022 FMR for your whole portfolio using an interim re-exam. And the only thing you would change is that payment standard instead of waiting to the next annual re-exam. And there's some analysis you would certainly need to do around that, because you're going to increase potentially a significant portion of your portfolio's HAP expenses by increasing your payment standards if you have a significant portion of your residents who are paying more than 30% of their income towards their rent. And so in order to analyze that, you can go to the HUD Utilization Tools website. If you've never seen this website, when you get the PowerPoint, you can just click on it, and it's a hyperlink, and it will take you. And actually, I'll just click on it. So HCV Tools, HCV Utilization Tools, right? You've got all kinds of information in here. From here, you can pull down HCV training videos regarding how to use the two-year tool. You can pull down your two-year tool projection based off of the VMS data that you have uploaded into VMS. And if you scroll down, it gives you a guide on how to use the success rate tracker that I showed you guys earlier. And finally, it's got a tool of tools. And in the tool of tools, it's got a payment standard tool that allows you to anticipate the repercussions of potential future payment standard changes on both the program costs and the participant rent burden. So it will help guide you on the impact of increasing your payment standard. The tool of tools can help you project what your payment standard is going to do to your per unit cost. Sometimes, and I'll be honest, sometimes the tool of tools is not very user-friendly. It's got a lot of components to it and a lot of spreadsheets. It's something that you have to take your time with and work on. And so you want to make sure that you spend the time to work in the tool for it to work well for you. One thing you can do, though, is if you can't get the tool of tools to work in an effective way for you, you can go old school with how you analyze the impact of a payment standard increase by pulling a report that shows all of your residents, voucher sizes, unit sizes, gross rents, and payment standards. And basically do it in a spreadsheet and do the math to determine the impact. And so in this case, you're going to want to look at voucher size and unit size because those impact, what your payment standard is going to be. You want to know the gross rent of the unit, the current payment standard, what the difference is between the gross rent and the payment standard, and then what your new payment standard amount is going to be, as well as the difference between your new payment standard and your gross rent. So in this case, what we can do from some old school analysis is see that by increasing our payment standard from $650 to $675, it's going to increase your HAP cost by $25, right? And so you would want to do this kind of analysis for your entire portfolio to see what the difference is going to be if you did it for, if you're a 100-unit program for 100 vouchers, or if you did it for, 3,000 vouchers. What's the impact and what's the cost? And that's what you can use the tool for. And if you can't use the tool, you can do it kind of this old school method to see how much your HAP expenses are going to go up. And then you would take that number and divide it by the total number of vouchers that you have, and that would tell you what your increased per unit cost would be. So for example, all right, I'll do some quick math on the calculator. And so if we had, $25, our rent went up, our HAP cost went up by $25. Let's just say it went up for 50 residents. It's $1,200. If we have 100 residents or 100 voucher holders, our per unit cost would then go up by $12.50 per voucher. And that's what you can do in your tool to determine how much your end of year amounts would be. So in this case, if this particular PHA's PUC went up by, let's just call it $13. Let's say it's now going to be $488, and it's dropping our potential reserves to 14.3% as opposed to 16.9. And so one way to augment the inability to lease up units is to increase your payment standards and then unilaterally apply it to all of your current participants. And you would have to do this before the end of 2020, which means you have to have sufficient staffing to handle the administrative work that would go into it. But it is a good way to pay down some of that reserve, okay? Another good thing that I think is often overlooked in terms of how to address leasing in general is looking at your rent reasonableness. So what methodology are you using to determine your rents? There's different systems in different ways and different variables that determine rent amounts. For example, I know one rent reasonableness system uses a grading system, right? So whether the units are graded as fair or average or good impacts what your rent reasonableness comes out as determining a unit to be reasonable. So it's important that you look at your actual market, where you're at, and adjust your rent reasonableness methodology to meet what the market is actually paying. Now, you could be like, yes, it's happening and we do that, but if you aren't, you need to make sure that you are. A way to get new landlords to participate in the program is to actually pay what the market is asking. And so one of the things to do is to look at your rent reasonableness methodology and determine if you're actually offering rents that rent for a unit that the market is now paying, $800 for, and you're still offering, $700 because of your rent reasonableness systems and your methodology for determining rents. So when it comes to rent reasonableness, there's a couple of things. You want to review the comparable units that you're using in your certifications and determine if they're in line with the actual market, right? So that's key. That's step one. Step 2 is review the comparable units that are used to ensure they're current. I talked to a lot of PHAs about utilization, and one of the things that one of the PHAs I was working with told me earlier in the week, or not earlier in the week, it was early last week, was that their rent reasonableness is using comparables from earlier in the year. So February of 2021 is what they told me was one of the units that they're using as a comparable. And so, from where things were on the rental side in February are probably significantly different than where they are now in October. So you need to make sure you're using current comps when you're determining rent reasonableness. And then a third option is review your methodology to determine how to conduct rent reasonableness. So if you're using a system like SocialServe or affordablehousing.com or Rentellect, those systems are set up to do things in certain ways. Are you prepared to potentially allow landlords to submit their own comps and use those to determine rent reasonableness? Could be an option, because what I think could be happening in some jurisdictions is that the rent reasonableness systems that are being used are not in line with the actual market, which is making it difficult for residents to find units that will accept a voucher, because the rents that are now being offered are significantly lower than they were, or they're the same as they were, a year ago or 8 months ago, but the market is no longer what it was a year ago or 8 months ago. So rent reasonableness, I think, is something that gets overlooked as a component to why it's harder to find units, because I don't think rent reasonableness is keeping up with the time. And I could be wrong in making a giant assumption, but based off of the conversations I've had in the systems I've used recently on a project as it relates to rent reasonableness, it's not necessarily what the market is offering. And so when it's a tight market and it's tough to lease units, you're certainly not going to be able to lease units from landlords where the rent that you're offering is significantly lower than what they can get in the open market. And so I certainly want you guys to take a look at your rent reasonableness systems for kind of these three components. So another thing and another leasing policy that affects leasing is portability. So are you an absorbing agency or an administering agency plays a role, right? So if you're underutilized, you're probably absorbing vouchers. So if you're, fine where you're at, you might administer vouchers and then absorb them at different times in the year to boost your utilization. But it's important for all PHAs to review the data that you have in your system to see how many of your vouchers are absorbed on a monthly basis, or how many of your ports are administered on a monthly basis, so that you can see how many vouchers you might lose or gain in a given month. Ports that are absorbed should account for, and I think I showed you guys this earlier, in the two-year tool in the same column as the project-based vouchers. So any projected, any planned leasing, if you're absorbing vouchers on a monthly basis and you absorb 5 a month, you should be absorbing those vouchers in that section of the two-year tool. And here it is. Okay, so ports are, they go in the other planned additions and reductions section, right? If you have more ports absorbed than other PHAs, if you have more ports absorbed than the other housing authorities that you absorb, you can enter a negative number in this section, and I spoke to that earlier too. So in here, if you're absorbing 5 ports a month and you're losing 3 ports a month, you can plan to add 2 ports a month, but you need to know your data. And that's kind of the key point to that, is you've got to know how many vouchers you have coming and how many you have going, because if you don't know and you don't put anything in there, you can't truly project what your program is going to look like. The other thing to be aware of is a lot of housing authorities that are billing, they tend to absorb at the end of a calendar year or at the beginning of a new calendar year. So if you have, say, 20 vouchers that you're being billed for, and 8 of them are with one PHA, I would be very leery at the end of a year that somebody's going to, at the end of a year, end of a calendar year, or beginning of a calendar year, that PHA might be absorbing those vouchers. Because what you're trying to do is boost your utilization at the beginning of a year a lot of times. And so what I do tend to see housing authorities do is absorb those vouchers at the beginning of a calendar year or at the end of a calendar year, depending on where their utilization's at. So again, know how many vouchers you've got out there that could potentially be absorbed, because it could significantly impact your program. And I'm going to get on a soapbox real quick, just to kind of put this out there for food for thought. There are a lot of housing authorities that are smaller, right? They have, 250 vouchers or less. And so if you're administering their ports and say you've got 5 of them, if you absorb 5 ports from a small PHA, you are potentially seriously, if you're a larger PHA, even if you're not a large PHA, if you're seriously potentially tanking the utilization for a small program by absorbing their vouchers. I'm just kind of putting that out there because I do work with a lot of smaller PHAs who are close to different metropolitan areas and have significant amounts of their vouchers being absorbed, and they're having to, go through the process of bringing more people onto their program from their waiting list and things like that. It gets a lot more difficult for a small PHA to go through the process of leasing than it does for a, well, I don't know. It does take a lot for a large PHA to do that as well. But what I'm saying is, if you are a large PHA and you have a lot of ports that you're absorbing from a smaller PHA, just understand that that has a much more significant impact on that small PHA than it does on yours. And so that's all I'll say about that. But keep that in mind as you're going through portability, and keep in mind that absorbing a number of vouchers from a small housing authority does have a very impressionable impact on that PHA's utilization. All right, another thing, analyzing EOPs, right? So we talked earlier about the turnover rate. And so it's important to measure and monitor how many vouchers you're losing in a given month and on your program as a whole. I think I showed everybody the graph earlier where, I think what happened in terms of EOPs at the beginning of COVID, it was at 11%, and now EOPs throughout the state of Alabama are at 9.5%. So it's down 2%. And you want to watch for that, the number of EOPs to start going up, because things have opened up to allow residents to be evicted and things like that. So to prevent that, it's important to look at what your policies are. So I don't know if I learned this in school when I was in college or if somebody told me this, but in business, you're taught that it's easier to retain a client than it is to get a new one. And so the same principle holds true for the voucher program. It's easier to keep your current participants than it is to turn them over. So, and I say that because if you have policies that are very punitive, that could potentially be addressed through other processes, it is very, it potentially hurts your ability to fully utilize your program. So I'll say it like that. What I would prefer PHAs do is to review their policies in regards to, missing recertification appointments or not submitting documentation through the mail, or whatever the case might be for why residents get EOP'd. and see if you can be as lenient as possible on that to maximize the number of vouchers that you have on your program. So PHAs need to analyze how many and why your participants leave the program. If you do that, you may be able to find that you have policies related to EOPs that are resulting in more residents being removed from your program than you need to. And so one of the things I would recommend here is certainly track your EOPs, find out why people are leaving your program, and see if it has anything to do that's related with your policies. Well, that's supposed to say project-based vouchers, but I think it's a link. So another thing you can look to do to boost your utilization is through project-based vouchers. And I'm not going to go deep into PBV, but it's an important tool that housing authorities can use to maximize your voucher utilization, right? So PBVs are hard units that are in your community that you can have your families lease. So a PHA can use up to 20% of your authorized vouchers to project-based units in a specific property if the owner agrees to either rehabilitate or construct new units, or if the owner agrees to set aside a portion of the units for an existing development. In certain cases, the PHA may use an additional 10% of its authorized vouchers for PBV assistance. And so why project-based vouchers are important is because if you have trouble having residents find and locate units within their community, if you're issuing vouchers, if you can have hard units where residents can reside in through project basing, it's a way to address the utilization of your program. Now, I'll say that, you know, project-based voucher is a beast in and of itself. There's a lot of processes and things like that that go into it. Specifically, if you're, you know, doing rehabilitation or new construction of units, that can take some time, but you can also PBV a currently constructed property. And so that's something that's something you could certainly look to do to increase the number of participants you have on your program. If, you know, there's no available units, you know, in the community, you could look to set out an RFP to allow owners to PBV units within your community. So project-based vouchers, also including RAD, because if you've gone through RAD, I don't know if any of you, I assume some of you have gone through RAD, but if you haven't gone through any RAD conversions or anything like that, you can either do PBV, which adds new basically adds new vouchers to your program. It doesn't necessarily help your utilization if they're RAD PBV. But if it's regular PBV, obviously you're allocating specific percentage of your vouchers to specific units within your community. As PBVs relate to leasing projections, so you've got a couple of things. You've got an AHAP, which is an agreement to enter into a HAP contract. If you are under an AHAP, which when I looked at the reporting that I shared at the beginning of the presentation, it looks like there aren't any PHAs that have an AHAP out there. But if you were under an AHAP, you need to plan for when those units would go under a HAP contract, as that would affect your utilization. Additionally, as it relates to PBV policies, so you have a decision to make. You can make a vacancy payment for vacant units at a PBV property. And why that's important is because if you aren't utilizing a PBV unit and you're not paying a vacancy payment, you're not spending any HAP funds for any of those units. What I do see a lot of is most PHAs that I've worked with, and when I say most, I'll say 75% of the PHAs that I've worked with don't make vacancy payments. So if that's something that, if you've got a large HAP reserve, that might be something to certainly look to do as it relates to PBV, because it can increase your utilization. Additionally, when it comes to PBV and RAD, another thing I do see if you do have RAD PBV units is PHAs, oftentimes I've seen them not paying the OCAP. And so for RAD, project-based vouchers, it's not necessarily a policy issue, but it's something that PHAs need to ensure that they're providing for RAD properties is an increase in that rent on an annual basis, and that's pegged with what's called the OCAP. And there's a link in here, and I'll just click it so you can see it. It's called the Notice of Certain Operating Cost Adjustment Factor for 2021. And so if you go down to your state, if you've got RAD PBV units, any RAD PBV unit, they would have a rental increase that would be increased at the time of the RAD HAP contract by 2.6%. So you want to make sure that you're accounting for an OCAP increase on any RAD PBV units that you have that go online. All right, so that's a little bit about PBV. As it relates to your two-year tool, you're going to utilize the planned additions and reductions column here in the two-year tool that I'm highlighting. What you're going to want to do is analyze how many PBVs you're leasing up on a monthly basis and entering that amount into that those associated column. If you're under an AHAP that's anticipating to go under a HAP contract in, say, September of 2022, you're going to want to enter that number into the vouchers being leased in that other planned additions and reductions column. So if you're going into a HAP contract in 2022, you're going to want to put 22 vouchers here in September so that you're accounting for the utilization of those vouchers at that time. And so I'm just showing an example here. If you're turning over 2 PBVs a month and leasing 2 PBVs a month, obviously you'll put 2 in there. In our little scenario, I broke it out into 2 different months because a lot of times at new properties, they aren't all leased up in the exact same month. So you might want to spread it out over a month and a half, 2 months, so that you're accounting for it and you're not over anticipating the lease up of those vouchers. And again, why this is an important column is because these numbers that are in here are not being multiplied by the success rate and are not being multiplied by how long it takes to lease up with a normal tenant-based voucher. So you're not taking 17 times 70% times 18, 22, 47, whatever the case might be, and anticipating when they're going to lease up. By putting it in this column, you're anticipating that unit to be leased up in that month, which will then boost the utilization of your program. So another big thing you need to look at is your waiting list. And this plays into a lot of different things. So in the success rate tracking worksheet that I showed you guys earlier in the two-year tool, in that same worksheet, there's a wait list issuance rate tracker. So it allows you to track how many names you pulled from your waiting list, how many vouchers were issued, and how many residents failed to lease. Actually, this isn't the leasing process. This is the waiting list process, right? So it allows you to take the number of vouchers or names you pulled from your waiting list, the number of vouchers you issued, and the number of residence files you went through that didn't actually get a voucher. And so in poll 1 here, they went through 55 names, issued 20 vouchers, 35 failed. In poll 2, pulled 100 names from the waiting list, issued 46 vouchers, and 54 failed. In poll 3, pulled 50 names from the waiting list, issued 40 vouchers, and 10 residents didn't get a voucher because they failed that lease-up process for a waiting list success rate of 51%. And so when it comes to the waiting list, it's important to track how successful your waiting list is because that determines a lot of things as well. Some things to consider when you're looking at your waiting list is how many people are on the list, right? Your leasing is dependent on your waiting list. And so knowing how many names you have to get through to issue X number of vouchers is extremely important. I feel like that's almost an algebra equation, right? So anyway, thinking about the waiting list some more is, if you have a very low waiting list issuance rate, determine if it's a stale list. If your waiting list success rate is below 30%, how old is that list? How accurate is the information or the resident information on that list? How many names are required to sort through to get one eligible applicant? Those are all extremely important items that you need to find out about your waiting list. And for any resident, additionally, any resident who fails to receive a voucher for whatever reason, you need to analyze that data and find out why those applicants who are on your waiting list for probably years have not been able to, why they didn't actually get a voucher, right? It's important to know your data. So when you're analyzing your waiting list, you want to look at some key things. When was the last time you opened the waiting list? Has it been 5 years? Has it been 3 months? It makes a difference. If you opened your waiting list 5 years ago and you're at the bottom of that list, you're not going to be very successful in leasing or getting residents who are responding to completing the eligibility process, because it's an old list. So a lot changes in 5 years. Kind of the second question in analyzing your waiting list is, when was the last time you purged the list? If you don't purge your waiting list, you're just asking to do double work, basically. If you purge it once a year, you can keep your waiting list fresher and hopefully more successful when you're trying to get residents to become eligible for the program so that you can issue vouchers. Another thing to think about is, how is the PHA attempting to contact applicants? Someone was telling me the other day, like, something went out that the mail system is about to be slowed down, and it might have already it might have already happened. Mailing things to applicants takes time, and sending things through the mail, and then an applicant mailing it back, there's a lot of back and forth that comes with it, and there's a lot of room for error. If you can find different ways to contact applicants and find multiple methods to reach out to them, you could potentially be more successful. One of the things I've found to be very important to getting applicant feedback and resident feedback in general is through the use of texting. And I know a lot of PHAs are probably still using hard phone lines to communicate with residents, but sending texts to people is a very immediate and impactful way to correspond with them. So when you're thinking about how you interact with your applicants or your residents, think about how can you send text messages to residents. And you might be like, Mike, applicants and residents change their phone numbers as well, and that's absolutely true. But it's another option for you to potentially reach more people and have fewer applicants falling through the cracks because you're making those other additional attempts. And that can be, obviously through regular mail, through email, through phone calls, through texting. Those are options you can have for the applicants who are on your waiting list to try and increase the success rate of your waiting list. How many attempts are you making? Are you sending one letter and giving someone 2 weeks to respond? And if they don't respond, then they're off your waiting list. Based off of how you want to plan for your leasing and how many names you want to go through your waiting list to determine eligibility should help provide you with an idea of how many attempts you should make. There's times that I know people say they sent me something and I never received it. And so sometimes you might want to consider making more than one attempt. to allow an applicant to submit documentation as it relates to eligibility. What are your PHA's background check policies? Do you have background check policies that are very punitive to applicants? Does it prevent more people from being eligible for the program based off of the policies that you might set as it relates to your background checks? And additionally, and kind of finally, what documentation is requested from the applicant? If you're asking an applicant to provide you, 6 pay stubs in 2 weeks and they just started a job, it's probably more discouraging for an applicant to provide that information than it would be to ask for 2. So looking at your policies as it relates to your waiting list and to eligibility to the same degree is, what are you asking from your applicant and what can you not ask for that might make it easier to be more successful in getting through the waiting list and eligibility process. So as I had mentioned earlier, in terms of the effect of kind of putting it together, right? The effect of an EOP on your utilization, right? So if you EOP one person and you have a 25% success rate from your waiting list and a 50% success rate for your voucher lease up, and it takes 2 to 2.5 months for a household to lease, it means that you're going to have to sort through 8 names on your waiting list to be able to issue 2 vouchers for every 1 person who is EOP'd or absorbed if it's a port. So thinking back to what I was talking about as it related to EOP and turnover, sometimes it's easier to keep the people on your program as opposed to knocking them off if your policy is punitive to the point of, easily terminating a voucher. So keep that in mind. For every 1 you're turning over, if your success rate is 25% and 50%, it's going to take you 3 months to fill that void. To the same point, if you're a small PHA, if you've got 5 vouchers that were EOP'd or absorbed with a 25% success rate on your waiting list and a 50% success rate on your voucher lease up, you're going to have to go through 40 names on your waiting list to issue 10 vouchers for 5 people who are EOP'd and or absorbed. So keep in mind the impact that these percentages have. And the impact really when it comes to waiting list to voucher issuance and then voucher issuance to lease up, the impact is on the administrative side of it. The impact is it's taking your waiting list team and your eligibility team a lot more time to replace 5 vouchers than it would to not replace them. So there's a big administrative expense that goes along with kind of the whole EOP process. All right, now I'll give you kind of one last example here. So the effect on utilization when you're looking at your estimated attrition through your program, and this is very important, is for this PHA, it has an estimated attrition of 24 vouchers a month. If this PHA has a waiting list success rate of 50% and a voucher success rate of 50%, on a monthly basis, they're having to issue 48 vouchers. To issue 48 vouchers, they need to go through almost 100 names on their waiting list to be able to issue those 48 vouchers. And this just to kind of keep the program stable, right? Because the intent here is you're replacing all of your vouchers on a monthly basis that you're losing. This represents a stable program. If you're a program where you have the ability to increase your program numbers because you're underutilized, you're now having to issue additional vouchers on top of that. So for a PHA with the same estimated attrition, as well as their waiting list percentages and your voucher success rate, but now this is a PHA who can lease 50 more vouchers, they're not only having to issue the 24 or issue the 48 a month just to keep pace, they're also having to go through another 100 names on their waiting list to be able to get 50 vouchers that lease up. So the effect of EOPs and turnovers and attrition, it all kind of plays in together. You need to be able to replace your vouchers on a monthly basis that you're losing, and you need to know how many people you need to go through on your waiting list, and how many people are actually going to lease up. Because for this specific program, if they're issuing, or if they're going through 100 names on their waiting list on an annual or on a monthly basis, in 16 months they're going to go through 1,600 names on a waiting list potentially. And so, if that's the case, you need to start thinking about, okay, at what point do I need to reopen my waiting list? Because I need to make sure that I can issue vouchers, and that's directly dependent on how many names are on your waiting list. And the other thing to definitely consider is, how long does it really take, right? How long does it take you to take somebody from the waiting list, schedule their appointment, interview them, conduct and determine eligibility, complete the briefing and issue the voucher, receive the RFTA, pass the inspection, successfully lease them up? Knowing how long it actually takes your program to do that is important. We're at the end of the calendar year. If you're looking to issue vouchers at the end of the year and you haven't issued them in a while, you need to have a realistic expectation of when you can actually get those issued, by knowing how long it takes your program to go through the process of determining these things. And so, when you are projecting your leasing, it's extremely important to know how long things actually take. The next thing is, how much staffing do you need to handle new leasing, or your leasing in general? Does your PHA have the staff capacity to handle the leasing? Does the staff have the proper training to increase the leasing? And what type of staff is needed to increase and or boost your leasing? All of the components of the voucher program that kind of go into it is, when you're talking about staffing, is waiting list and eligibility. Do you have waiting list and eligibility staff? Do you have staff who can issue vouchers and conduct briefings? Do you have staff to process RTAs or RFTAs, depending on what acronym you use? Do you have an inspector who's reliable and can go out and inspect your units in a timely fashion? Do you have customer service available for those residents to be able to address those issues? And then, do you have staff to handle the contract and leasing component? For a lot of smaller PHAs, some of you might be doing all of these things. But for your larger PHAs who might be on the call, this is something that you can break out and have different staff responsible for different pieces, if that makes sense to your to efficiently operate. So staffing plays a big role in being able to increase the capacity as it relates to the leasing and utilization of your program. So you always want to keep that in mind. If you know you need to issue a bunch of vouchers and you haven't issued in a while, you got to make sure you got the staff to do it. And that's why the two-year tool is there, is to help you plan for that. So you know what months you need to do different things and make sure you have staffing available to do it. If anybody has any questions from the last section, please feel free to put those in the chat. We do have a question here from Charday. She asks, what are some suggestions on getting more landlords to become vendors? One issue clients repeatedly say is that there are no available units. So that is a great question, and we are going to address it in this upcoming section called Putting It All Together. So I will answer that question here in shortly. Okay, so we're going to kind of, what I'm trying to do is summarize that and put it all together, kind of what we talked about and some other things here. So, what's really important at this point is that you know your program. Oh, actually, we just got another question. Before we continue, let's answer that one. So we got a question from Tony. She asks, In determining rent reasonableness, we have a hard time approving the rents that the landlords are asking. We are at 110%. 3-bedroom payment standard for us is $868, and landlords are asking $800 to $1,000. So obviously, that is a tough situation. You know, you do have residents who can go up to 40% on a new admission, which does increase their rent burden, but that can help cover it. If you're using 110%, I would say if you're using 110% of the 2021 FMR and your 2022 went up, implement that 2022 FMR ASAP. Kind of how that works is you can implement the FMR within the first 3 months after it's published. So you could implement the 2022 FMRs as early as November 2021. And so you could look at that as an option if that would work for you. There's another thing you can do when it comes to payment standards that I didn't go into, which is small area FMRs. So if there's different areas in your jurisdiction that have significantly higher higher FMRs, you could look at implementing small area FMRs that would increase the payment standards in specific areas. In which case, obviously, some units would potentially be able to be utilized if you have a higher payment standard in certain areas. But if that's something you have an interest in learning more about, there's a lot of information on HUD's website as it relates to small area FMRs. I wasn't planning on going into detail on that today, but that's something you could look into as well to address your payment standard issues. So kind of to paraphrase, step one, see if you're using your 2021 payment standard or 2021 FMR or 2022. If you're still using your 2021, use your 2022 as long as it went up as soon as possible. All right, so in terms of kind of putting this all together, so first off, know your program. You need to know how many vouchers you lose on a monthly basis and why you're losing vouchers, and see if there's anything you can do that are related to your policies that are potentially resulting in the loss of more vouchers than you actually would want. Kind of next step is, what is your success rate? This is, like I said at the beginning, or in one of the beginning sections, is, to me, this is kind of one of the most important things, is know what your success rate is, and if it's low, know why it's low. I know that a lot of places are, a lot of PHAs are experiencing a limited availability of units within their communities, but see what that actually is and see what you can do to increase the success rate of those vouchers. Some of the options we talked about were looking at your payment standards, as well as looking at your rent reasonableness methodology to determine if that's why your success rates are low. What's your applicant success rate? Why is that low? If your applicant success rate is low, determine is it related to your policies? And finally, how many vouchers can you issue? Knowing how many vouchers you can issue based off of your funding availability is important to determine how you should proceed moving forward with the leasing process. If you don't know how many vouchers you can actually issue, then you're flying blind for your program. In terms of how many vouchers do I lose a month, you need to analyze that information and determine if it relates to your policy decisions, lease termination process, if that's part of the issue, or does it relate to portability? And if so, how many vouchers are you losing due to portability? And how you can plan for the attrition of those ports. Or another option would be, if you have a lot of ports that move to a neighboring PHA, is talk to that PHA and see if they can administer that voucher for you. I'm not too proud to beg. I will I will beg a PHA not to absorb my vouchers if it means that I can continue to utilize my program at a high level, as opposed to being at the mercy of someone who absorbs a whole bunch of my vouchers all at the same time, because that can be devastating. How many vouchers can you issue? You got to know your funding, how much money you have to spend, and how many vouchers you can lease up. You got to use the two-year tool to know that information. What's your applicant success rate? So why is it low? How do I communicate with residents? Can I communicate just through the mail and expect the mail to be delivered on time and then it mailed back to me in a timely fashion? Can I put in extra steps to implement my team to make phone calls, send text messages or emails? And then if you're sending text messages, do you have the proper software to communicate via text with your applicants and or your residents? In terms of how can I incorporate, could you look at your application process and incorporate an additional question asking, how can I, what's your preferred method of communication so that you know the best way to reach somebody? Are you calling emergency contact people on applications? Are you asking for an emergency contact people or person so that you can at least give it everything you've got with people who are on your list? Because we all know there's a lack of affordable housing, and if we're not going to take that extra step to try our best to get a hold of people, then we're really doing a disservice to the people who spent the time to apply. And then lastly, do I have enough names on my waiting list? If you're at the end of your waiting list, you need to make sure that you are opening that back up and making sure you have a sufficient supply of names. With a low success rate and a low waiting list success rate, you need to make sure that you're not shooting yourselves in the foot by doing a lottery and only taking 1,000 names on a waiting list when you know you've got, you've got to go through, 1,000 a year. You don't want to, you don't want to shoot yourselves in the foot by not taking enough names on your waiting list. And finally, what is my success rate and why is that low? So what types of landlord outreach am I doing? What information is being provided about applicants during briefings? And is my rent reasonableness using current market condition comps? Those are all important questions you need to ask yourselves in regards to your success rate. And as it relates to that, landlord outreach is extremely important. And this is goes back to one of the questions we received. How do I get more landlords to become vendors on my program? And clients are saying there's no units available. So, kind of to that end, you've got to reach out to the landlord. I know vouchers at one point when I got in housing, I don't know, 17 years ago or whatever, it was like Field of Dreams, give them a voucher and we will come. It's not the same situation anymore. A voucher holder has to work to find a landlord, and the housing authority has to work to find landlords to participate in the program. So the question obviously is, how do you get landlords to participate in the program? Well, you've got to ask them. You've got to ask them, why do your current landlords participate in the program? And you can do this through a variety of ways. You can send out surveys to your landlords through SurveyMonkey or some other method and ask them, why are you participating on the program? How can we make it better for you? Because the voucher program is a partnership. It's not just, give them a voucher and they will come, because it doesn't work like that anymore. You've got to get feedback as to why you have the landlords that you do have actually participate in your program. A landlord roundtable is oftentimes very helpful. Offering landlords an opportunity to get together with other landlords to talk about the program, to talk about issues. And having these types of conversations, you can get an idea of what you might need to do differently or what you might need to do better, or what might attract new landlords. Leasing fairs can be helpful. If you're issuing a lot of vouchers, I was talking to a PHA the other day who they said they were inviting landlords to come to their voucher issuance briefings. So vouchers are being issued to residents and landlords are there talking about their program or their units as well. So invite landlords to talk to you guys about, or to talk to the residents about leasing by inviting them to be a part of it, because they are a part of it. And the voucher program does not work without the landlord. And so you need to have some interesting opportunities for them to provide feedback to you as to what works. Give them an opportunity to lease their units as quickly as possible, and at a voucher issuance could be an effective way to do that. And finally, incentive programs. I've heard a lot about incentive programs from a lot of PHAs, and they're doing a variety of different things. And many PHAs have used some of the CARE Act administrative fee funding to incentivize landlords to participate in the program. So some examples of that, and maybe it would be beneficial if I look up some examples and provide information on that to everybody on this call. But some incentive programs that I've seen different housing authorities offer is offering a bonus for putting new units on the program that have never been leased in the program before. So whether that's $1,000 one-time payment or a $500 one-time payment, I've heard of housing authorities doing invite a friend promotion, or a friend in this regard is another landlord. So bringing another landlord to sign up their units on a program incentivizes people to participate potentially. And one other thing that I don't think I listed here is, one thing you can, the other thing I heard another PHA do is they hired, basically they hired somebody in the community to work with landlords and to do landlord outreach. And they've paid that person, or I think it was a business, a flat fee to get more landlords to participate in the program, in which for every unit that they lease up, they get a certain fee, and every voucher that goes unleased for a family they work with, they get a lesser fee. And so something you could look at doing is bringing in a third party to be like a housing type navigator for your participants, who can build relationships with landlords as well as work with voucher holders to help them locate units. I've heard that it's been successful in some communities, so it could certainly be something else that that could be helpful to some of your housing authorities. Additionally, as I spoke about earlier, it's having rent reasonableness that's actually what the market is, and payment standards that are maximized through the 2022 FMRs if they went up for you. If they went down, that is unfortunate, but you could also look at utilizing small area FMRs for certain areas if that would be helpful as well. Another good landlord outreach component is education, is educating landlords on your program. I remember back when I ran a voucher program many years ago, landlords would always complain about inspections, right? Because they didn't know what we were looking for when we would inspect the unit. So potentially bring landlords in and providing some education on how the program works, so that they're better qualified to address those issues as it relates to, something like HQS or the contract and leasing process. Another option that I highly recommend is educating residents and applicants on how to approach landlords. A lot of times, an applicant or a resident goes to see a unit and they've got a piece of paper in their hand. They said it's worth $886, and that's how they start a conversation with the landlord. And that's not always the best approach. Educating landlords on how to approach, or educating residents or applicants on how to approach landlords is extremely important. I remember when I moved from Ohio to Georgia about 7 years ago, and my approach with the landlord was, more of an interview. You want to be prepared to present yourself in an excellent light, specifically when you're competing against multiple other people. Having a likability factor is very important if you approach a landlord and develop a conversation and a rapport on the onset of a conversation of seeing a unit. If you can win them over with, being, presenting yourself in a positive light, does play a big role in a landlord making a decision as to whether they're going to select two equally qualified participants for the same unit. So educating residents and applicants on approaching landlords and not leading with the voucher, but leading with them as a human is something that I think oftentimes gets overlooked, and is something that's very important to ensuring that a resident can build that relationship with the landlord on a human level before they're like, oh, here's my $886 piece of paper, will you take it? It's a lot more difficult for someone to say no if you're likable. I'll say that. The last thing is listing services. So there's different listing services that PHAs use to list available, for landlords to use to list available units, and for residents and applicants to find available units. Listing services are used throughout the country, whether it's through affordablehousing.com or socialserve.com. Those are opportunities for landlords to list available units within their community, and residents and applicants to go online and find those units from those specific websites. Depending on how tech savvy some landlords might or might not be, it could work. I think a lot of the PHAs that I work with do use listing services, but many of them also use landlord bulletin boards at their central offices, or a listing of landlords who participate in the program and might have vacancies. What I would recommend is using listing services, online listing services, as opposed to providing a landlord with a handout of 40 landlords they could call, not knowing if there's a vacant unit or not. So it's important to provide a landlord an opportunity to list a unit, and an applicant or resident use that same service to locate a unit, because that is mutually beneficial to both the landlord and to the resident. So in terms of developing a leasing plan, a monthly turnover, so kind of what you need to know, right? Monthly turnover tells you how many vouchers you need to be able to issue on a monthly basis to keep your program stable. The next component is knowing the success rate, tells you how many vouchers you need to issue. So to keep your program stable, you need to know how many you need to issue based off of how successful those applicants are going to be. You need to know if your ports are helping or hurting your program and plan accordingly. So are you losing more to absorptions, or are you gaining more vouchers through absorbing? Know how much cash you have to spend, because it will tell you how many vouchers you can ultimately use. If you don't know how much cash you got, you're flying in the blind. And then to project out your leasing for 2 years is extremely important, and having a plan that's actually successful. Like everything else for leasing plans, everything else in housing, that plan will change over time. You need to update it monthly as soon as you have new information, as soon as you can update the plan with the actuals as opposed to your projections, because those will change. You need to review your plan monthly with your finance department, as I spoke about early on, to ensure you have sufficient HAP funds to cover the expenses. And if you don't have those HAP funds to cover the expenses, you need to make sure that you're working with your FMC to get additional funding that you need to cover expenses that exceed your actual disbursements of your HAP payments. Again, updating your 2-year tool monthly for your success rate, as well as updating for the number of vouchers that you are issuing. You need to update that and keep it current so that you can make sure that you have a plan that actually can be tracked and measured in real time, as opposed to, trying to reinvent the wheel every month. Use your updated, most current success rates in the number of vouchers you've issued, because your success rates might change over time, right? If you increase your payment standards and adjust your rent reasonableness methodology to increase the number of vouchers that are successfully used in your program, if your success rate goes up, it means the number of vouchers you need to issue will go down. And so you need to keep track of that on a monthly basis as well, so that you've got a plan for how you're going to lease moving forward. When it comes to your leasing plan, you've got to be aware of your operations, right? You can't lease people if you don't have staff who know what they're doing, or if you don't have staff who know how to do the work. You need to know how you need to plan for your staffing needs, right? Review, if you're a larger PHA, obviously review your org chart and see if you have sufficient staffing to address increased leasing. Cross-train your staff. So if you're doing a big leasing push, you have staff that you could pull from other departments or other parts of the voucher operation that could assist in the leasing process. Bring in new or temporary staff if you need to. Your admin fees going up if you increase your leasing, it gives you the potential to be able to cover those budgetary increased costs, as well as improve leasing. I just said that. Improve leasing from increased admin fees earned. So, the number of vouchers that you're leasing up will help you retain and receive more revenue, admin fee revenue coming into your program. And then the last piece is outreach. You've got to reach out to the landlords. I'd start with talking to the ones you currently have and asking them, what do they like about the program? What don't they like? And then making adjustments to your program based off of the feedback you get from your partner, because the landlord is your partner and you're dependent on them. Kind of in closing of this section, the keys are to analyze your program, plan for what you're going to do, and then execute that plan. It takes all three. You can't just go in blind without knowing. You've got to plan for it, and then you've got to have the pieces in place to execute. And so I wanted to do next a quick two-year tool demo. But before I do that, are there questions in the chat about that section? So there's a question from Monica. What incentives can we use to get landlords? You can use a variety of incentives. I've heard of giving sign-on bonus incentives for listing new units. I've heard of referrals from other landlords. So if one landlord refers another landlord and they put a new unit on the program, I've heard of that type of incentive taking place. So there are opportunities to incentivize landlords. Those are the two common ones that I've heard. I've also heard of the starting of risk mitigation pools. So you have a pool of cash that you can provide to a landlord if they're leasing to a voucher holder, so that if there's damages to the unit, the landlord can get reimbursement for any damages that have been caused by a voucher participant. Those are the three main ones that come off the top of my head that I remember. But I'm interested in hearing from you guys. Are there different incentives that anybody on the call is utilizing that you found to be successful? So there's a response here from Paul. We're starting a leasing bonus to target our special population vouchers. Okay, that could work. So my question is it just for the special voucher populations? Could you open that up to all of your voucher participants? Paula says incentive bonuses helped. Okay, that's great, but they used all their CARES Act money and need more. So I will certainly relay that to the HUD team, because if it did make an impact, that's awesome. And you guys do need more funds to see what you can do to help residents. Other things you could consider outside of incentives, I know you could consider things like barriers to your program participants. So if you have barriers to program participant being able to pay a security deposit, partner with different community organizations who might be able to assist in locating funds for those services, whether that's through United Way or Red Cross, different local church communities sometimes have funding available to assist participants as it relates to that. Those would all be options. It's not really an incentive, but it does help reduce any barriers to leasing that a resident might have. Any other leasing incentives that any other PHA out there has utilized to improve the participation? Okay, here we go. Shirley says they're still paying a $500 incentive bonus for landlords listing new units, and it's helping. That's great. So a lot of things, obviously cash incentivizes people, right? If you have the cash for it to get more landlords to participate in your programs, that's a great thing. So incentives do work, as now witnessed by Shirley and Paula. Okay, so here's a question from Kelly. What funds can be used for incentives? So what I've seen most PHAs use to incentivize their voucher programs is from the CARES Act administrative funds. That's generally what I've seen the most, that's what I've seen used the most as it relates to incentivizing landlords. I'm not sure. I would assume the answer to this is yes. If you can use your regular admin fee for different incentives. That's not something I know off the top of my head, but I think it's worth me looking into to give you a correct answer to that, because that might be valuable to some of you as well. And so just to talk about the CARES Act fund for a second, right? So in your two-year tool, it's got a section here under L, column L, row 18, which shows CARES Act admin fees. So this specific PHA here received $260,000 in CARES Act admin fees that they can utilize to incentivize their program. So if you're wondering how much you got as it relates to your CARES Act, it should be in your two-year tool. All right. So I'm going to do a quick demo of this, and I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I think it's worth showing how this all kind of plays out. And so what I've got here is I've got a PHA, right? So they have 898 vouchers. They've got 898 vouchers at the beginning of 2021. They're carrying that over into 2022 and 2023. They're set to have an offset of $30,000 of their HAP reserves. Up in our top right-hand corner where it says summary outcomes, this is what I keep an eye on as I'm playing in the tool, right? So let's say, so in this case, they're at 14.1% at the end of 2021, 16.9 at the end of 2022. As we talked about earlier, because they have over 500 vouchers, they're subject to offset if they have more than 4% of HAP reserves, and they're at 14 and 16. So what we have their program success rate at is 42%, and an annual turnover rate of 9.5%. Their lease up is 64 in the first 30 days, 33% in 30 to 60, 3% in 60 to 90 days, and 0 after that. And what that tells me is they're not issuing extensions on those vouchers, but that's another conversation for another time, because they need to extend vouchers to give people more opportunity to lease those units. As we scroll down further into the tool, kind of the thing to keep an eye on here, they've got $300,000 in HUD held reserves as of the beginning of 2021 or the end of 2020. So they've got a significant HUD held reserve in there. As we scroll down, it looks like the PHA has issued vouchers for most of the year. We've got information up through October, and we haven't done any work to project leasing moving into 2021 and 2022. If you don't know whether your PHA has project-based vouchers or not, you can come down here to the bottom, and there's a section here that gives you a little bit of information as it relates to any special programs you might have or any PBV. So in this case, looking through here, it looks like they have 65 unleased VASH vouchers, and that's all they have. So they don't have any PBVs. I don't have any information as it relates to portability. So let's just go ahead and assume what we're going to be doing with this PHA is just issuing vouchers. And so to have the largest effect on your program is you want to issue vouchers. It has the biggest impact at the end of the year and at the beginning of the year. And I'll give you an example. So let's just say we issue 40 vouchers every month here for a couple of months, right? Let's do 5 months. And now we can see our 2022 HAP reserve down over here is down to 8.6%, okay? Now, I'm going to delete that out just to show you something. If that number went from 40 to 80 in November and December, and then 40 a month after that, it's going to have a more profound impact because their vouchers will be in use for a longer period of time. Now, we wouldn't necessarily want to do that all at the same time because, look, we become way over leased here. But for the intent of the exercise, what we're showing is that our 2022 amounts significantly went down if we leased more or issued more vouchers at the beginning or at the end of 2021 as opposed to if we just issued our 40 where we'd be at 8% instead of 5%. It would put us over leased, but just trying to show the purpose of that. So what we want to make sure, right, looking at our attrition rate, which is right here, so we're losing 6 vouchers a month, and their turnover rate or their success rate was around 50%. I think it was 48%. So we need to issue a minimum of 12 vouchers just to stay even throughout the year. And so what we'll do is, I think 40 is a good number there at the end of the year, but we can bring that down because we're getting kind of close to full utilization. We know some of these are VASH. So the reality of actually having all of those vouchers leased up and issued outside of receiving a bunch of VASH referrals is unlikely. But we know we're going to need to issue, you know, a minimum of, if we're losing 7 people a month, a minimum of 14 after that. So if we pushed it down to 14, it gives us sufficient cushion here on our HAP reserve, right? So we're at 8.8, and we've reduced that significantly from where we were at. And then if we go ahead and I'm going to wave a magic wand like I did a payment standard analysis and assume that our per unit costs are going to go up by $25 if we implement all of our payment standards at the end of 2021 for our whole program, which is going to raise our per unit cost to 500. And in doing so, it reduces our HAP reserve to 3.3%, as opposed to where it was at close to 8%. What we do need to do is we need to analyze that, because if that number went to 525, that would throw us into shortfall, right? So we certainly want to analyze the impact of our payment standard. Otherwise, we could find ourselves in this situation, which would mean backing out the issuance of some of these vouchers here, right? So if we drop that down to like 10, that would put us at 0, which we really don't want to be at either. But I think you get what I'm trying to say. So it's important to analyze the impact of that payment standard. I do think it's a great opportunity to pay out some of your reserves so that you can secure future funding. Because the key is, right, the key here is in this number, right? The $5.364 million that you spend in 2022 is going to be what you receive in 2023. So you want to secure the long-term funding of your program by maximizing the usage of your funds. So if we didn't do any leasing, or actually let's leave all of our leasing in there, right? And let's take out our payment standard increase, we're going to end up at 11% in HUD held reserves. We're only going to spend $4.8 million, and our 2023 funding is going to be 4.8 instead of 5.3. So the tool allows you to kind of manipulate the numbers and play with them to see what gets you in a sweet spot. And if at any point, your leasing improves significantly, later in the year, you can pull back some of these vouchers that you've issued so that you don't, fall into a shortfall situation or anything like that. But that's a good way to work on the tool. And then for the success rate tracking, what I had mentioned earlier, and I have it up here, but if you want to find your success rate tracking worksheet, you can right click and go to unhide, and it gives you all these hidden tabs in the 2-year tool. And the one you're looking for is the success rate tracking tab, which is this one here. So for this specific PHA, they've been filling out their tracker to see the success rate of their program and how long it's taking residents to lease up. They haven't been using their waiting list success rate tracker, but they're able to see where their tracking is as it relates to their program here. So that's something that's very important to use. And so all you're really doing is you're putting in the number of vouchers that you issued. So, they've already filled it out, but they've issued 3 vouchers in June, 1 voucher issued, or 1 voucher leased up here in August. The other 2 failed, meaning didn't lease up. In July, they issued 5 vouchers. 4 of them leased up in August. 1 of them failed. And that the information you put into this section here with the yellow populates all of these formulas down here. So remember, the only thing you need to input is in the yellow sections. Is there anything in particular anybody would want to see on the tool? It is highly recommended, as I think it's really the most important thing that you can use to make sure that you maximize your program. Please feel free to ask any additional questions in relation to the material we've gone over today, and we will answer them on the call. And I appreciate everybody taking the time to get on this training today, and feel free to ask any questions, as I'll stick around for a while and respond to anything you might have. All right, so we have a question in the chat. All right, and this is from Angela. When projecting, what about column G? All right, let's go to column G. So column G, that's a great question, Angela. So column G you're going to use for your ports and your PBV. So in this particular PHA, they didn't have any ports or didn't have any PBV, and I didn't project ports, but we certainly can. If we assume that they absorbed 1 port a month, we can just put a 1 in every column here. And it obviously shrinks our HUD held reserve at the end of 2022 to 2%. The other thing we could do is, depending on the analysis of ports for this PHA, if they say they lost 2 ports a month because they're in a metropolitan, outside of a metropolitan area where they have a significant number of voucher holders leaving on a monthly basis, and they're being absorbed by another PHA, and they've determined they're losing 2 a month, we could put a negative amount in there, and that would obviously increase our HAP reserve because it's removing vouchers from our program on a monthly basis if it's for portability. For project-based vouchers, if they had, let's say they had a 20-unit PBV property coming online in, let's just say April of 2022, they're going to put a 20 in there, which is going to obviously tank our reserve, and so we'll want to then pull back the number of vouchers we're issuing probably in November here, so that we don't go into shortfall. But that's a great question. I like column G. I think it's an underused column. Sure. Let's see. Thanks for the question, Angela. Can I go over smaller housing agency projections? Yes. All right. So to answer your question, Angela, here is a smaller PHA, right? So this smaller PHA has 108 vouchers under their ACC. They've got 47,000 in budget authority funding. They don't have anything really going on with their offsets or set-asides or PHA income. They're got 91,000 in a HUD held reserve at the beginning of 2021. And so kind of looking through this PHA, if we scroll up and let's find, so they have a success rate of 62% and an EOP rate of 11.7%. And so in this particular case, let's go down and see what their leasing projections are. So it looks like initially they're looking to issue 2 vouchers here in October, 10 in November, 2 in December, and then 2 every month after that. In looking at their estimated attrition, right? So they're losing 1 voucher a month, right? And then they are they're issuing a bunch, well, not a bunch. They're issuing a bunch of new vouchers here at the end of this year. And actually, looking at this, we are sitting on a negative HAP reserve at the end of 2022. So we'll probably want to pull down some of that and drop it closer to 6 or even 4, just to kind of deal with attrition. Their program, it looks like they've got 108 and 77 vouchers, 108 unit month available and 77 vouchers leased. Kind of looking at the program as a whole here, they don't have a lot of wiggle room when it comes to the cash that they have to issue a whole lot of vouchers. But what they are doing is by issuing 2 a month, they're basically replacing their vouchers that they're losing on a monthly basis. They'd probably want to drop in another 2 there just to kind of keep it up. But their HAP reserve only being at 14.9%, you know, it's barely over that 12% threshold for a PHA under 250. So they're not in a bad spot there. What I would look for that PHA to kind of look after is their per unit costs. Obviously, the per unit costs are projecting out on an average of $555 a month. The most recent HAP cost was $566. So, you know, you could see a $560 in there, you know, kind of $570. They're going to want to be careful not to go too high on their per unit costs because it can tank their reserve relatively quickly. The other thing, knowing this PHA a little bit, the one thing that's not showing in here is they're in a metropolitan area where they lose vouchers due to portability on a pretty consistent basis, which I know happens to a lot of smaller PHAs. But if they are losing, you know, vouchers consistently, they're going to want to, you know, beef up those numbers too. So, you know, depending on kind of what they've got going with their ports, if they're losing a lot of ports, or if they are issuing a lot of vouchers, they're going to need to watch that HAP reserve. But they're not in a terribly bad spot. But it's kind of the same as a big PHA. You're just using smaller numbers a lot of times. And so that's something to kind of keep in mind as you're going through this process. Is there anything in particular you're wanting me to show you, Angela? The other thing that happens with these small PHAs when they're in metropolitan areas is, you know, a big metropolitan PHA could, you know, who could be administering 5 of their vouchers could really just squash their program really quickly. You know, if we look at it now, let's say none of their vouchers are being absorbed, but if a large PHA were to absorb, say, 5 of their vouchers, it just jumps that up to 7%. Depending on how many ports they have that are being administered, it can really put them in a bad spot relatively quickly if they have a lot of ports that get absorbed, you know, all at the same time. So that's something to definitely be aware of, is where your ports are at. If you're a small PHA, be aware of where your ports are at and how those usually get handled. All right, so Paula, the growth in Huntsville has caused rental rates to skyrocket. You don't see how we can compete, even at 110% of FMR. So there are other things you can do as it relates to that in terms of your FMR. So you can go up to, you can look at utilizing small area FMRs. And I didn't go into that on this call because I don't think it was warranted at this time, but something to definitely look into, Paula, is small area FMRs. And I'm going to see if I can pull it up real quick. So there's a lot of information as it relates to small area FMRs. Oh, you are using small area FMRs. Okay. To be completely honest, I'm not super familiar with Huntsville at all. So I'm not sure where that's totally located there in the state. But lifting your payment standards up to 120 using small area FMRs could be a step in the right direction. I mean, all the communities are different, you know. every PHA is different. Everything about every entity is a little bit different. And so, kind of the challenges specific to there in Huntsville, I'm sure are different than they will be in different communities. But I think, if you can get up to 120, I think that's great. Huntsville, okay, Huntsville's the largest city in Alabama. I'm not sure why I thought that was Montgomery or Birmingham. Okay. So like a lot of large metropolitan communities that I work with throughout the country, they're experiencing large issues as it relates to leasing on their voucher program. One thing you could look to do as well, I don't know if you have, is project-based vouchers. Okay, a lot of wealth and rocket scientists. Okay, interesting. So you could look at, are you using project-based vouchers at all as a way to secure hard units in your community? Okay, so you've got developments breaking ground soon. That's good. It's going to take a while to, get those developments built. So if it's just breaking ground now, it's probably not going to help you till like 2023 at this point. If it takes, 12 to 18 months to get it up and going. So you could look at PBVing currently already constructed units. So you wouldn't necessarily have to wait for breaking ground, or not breaking ground. You wouldn't have to wait for those developments to be finalized and completed. Are you under an AHAP with those two properties? Okay. So you've got a senior development too. That's good. Yeah, so what you're going to want to do as it relates to those PBV properties is determine at which point they're going to go under. Okay, there we go. The first is under AHAP with 49 PBVs. Yeah, so what you're going to want to make sure you do is based off of when, and you're a while off, and this is just, I'm just pulling up this tool that's here, and it's only a small PHA, but you're going to want to make sure you account for those PBV units in the month that you think they're going to lease up. So, if it's going to be November 2022, which probably unlikely, I'd give it 2 months for leasing to lease up the community and put it there in your column G, which is your other planned additions and reductions. But yeah, PBVs can certainly help in communities where it's a super tight market. And PBVs are also placed, or PBVs are set at 110% of the payment standard, or 110% of the FMR. So it's, a good opportunity to maximize the rents for PBV property owners if that's something that could entice them. Another thing to consider too, it sounds like you guys have a lot of development there. If it's the largest city there in Alabama, one thing that you want to keep in mind is LIHTC units are required to accept vouchers. So if you have LIHTC communities, make sure you try and establish a relationship with them so that they don't break the rules and say they won't accept your voucher because they're required to. I'm assuming they probably have a waiting list and things like that, but it's a good idea to develop relationships with low-income public housing properties to use vouchers as well. Okay, yes, but they require 3 times the rent for income as a workaround. Okay. So they don't allow you to use the voucher as a form of income as a way to discriminate against the voucher? What it sounds like to me? Yeah, that's discouraging. Let me research that. I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know you could use that as a workaround. Let me see if that's some kind of violation for you, because that sounds ridiculous to me. Seeing no additional questions coming through from the chat, I want to thank you everybody for taking the time to attend the training today. I hope you all learned something, and for those PHAs that we'll be working with here in the near future, I appreciate you taking the time, and we look forward to working with you guys. I wish everybody has a happy evening, and we'll talk soon. Thanks.